All human life is precious, and the point at which one individual views his life as more precious than another is the very point at which other lives are placed in jeopardy, violated, and in extreme cases, terminated. Now, think about that for a second. If each individual viewed his life and all life as precious and worthy of their own personal protection, no person would ever lift a hand or devise a scheme to harm the life of another. When the mindset of an individual or group of individuals thinks less of somebody else's life than they do of their own, great mischief befalls the victims of that mindset and creates a civilization that welcomes, justifies, and even applauds forceful, violent, and coercive measures, so long as the collective masses who consent to such aggressive actions are assured that their own lives will be made safe by the very aggressors who are bringing harm to others. And it goes without saying that the legitimacy of these aggressors is enhanced when they appear as the official-looking, costume-wearing agents from the untouchable criminal organization called government. And that is the core mindset of all statists. Put plainly, though he wouldn't do it himself, the statist doesn't mind having the entity called government hurting people and taking their stuff. Now, if you or I hurt somebody and took their stuff, well, we'd be jailed. But when bankers do it, they're bailed. And the government keeps the masses controlled and in submission by continually promising to provide them with security and prosperity. Oh, under the threat of force, if you don't agree with them and if you don't submit to their policies. But in order to really understand the corruption and see through the violent nature of governments, we need to first examine and define the deceptive terminology that has the masses hoodwinked. And we need to steer clear of all the whitewashed propaganda peddled by mainstream media outlets and government textbooks. So let's get started with the first term, elections. An election is that time of year when citizen slaves participate in the illusory ritual of choosing which lying political puppet will deceive them, plunder them, waste their money on things they don't want or need, and intimidate, cage, and murder countless individuals on their dime in the name of protecting their freedom. Elections are useful tools employed by the elite who sit atop the human food chain to deceive the masses into thinking that they have the power to exercise control in order to effect a more comfortable outcome for their lives. To sum it up, elections are an effective control technique used by the elites to pacify the masses. And, as usual, the bread and circuses delivered to the masses by governments and their propaganda machines keep the people deceived, distracted, and divided. Government, a collective gang of nefarious individuals, most of them politicians and lawyers, who formulate new commands called laws in order to create monopolies and forcefully extract the laboring energies of their victims for the purpose of removing liberties, waging wars, and expanding its own power. With the recorded democidal deaths of over 260 million human beings in the last century alone, it's no stretch to say that governments are the most deadly institutions ever devised. When pressed, even the most ardent statist will admit that governments have a history of specializing in plundering, oppressing, and murdering their own subjects on a scale unmatched by even the most deadly and prolonged wars. Politicians, the governmental version of a used car salesman, these charismatic, psychopathic parasites are known to be guided by greed, controlled by bankers, funded by special interest groups, and willing to abandon principle for profit, even as they proclaim themselves to be champions of individual liberties. To compound an already dire situation, today's senators and congressmen are politically and financially incentivized to work against individual rights and the lives of American citizens. The Supreme Court, these black-robed priestly tyrants of the state, issue their own decrees which violate the plain words of a document they swore to uphold, as well as suspend the rights of the individual while claiming to protect the collective whole. These, as well as the judges in the lower courts, serve as the gatekeepers of a financial windfall for the state through the extraction of money from people who've been arrested and kidnapped by badged thugs and incarcerated on bogus charges that have nothing to do with the violation of anyone's life, or liberties. In other words, there's usually no victim, so there could be no legitimate crime. But this is nothing new. History is replete with examples of judges perverting justice, stripping rights, and confiscating the wealth of the populace through the blackmail tactic of plea bargain shenanigans. The President of the United States. Even though he's known widely as the leader of the free world, the President is nothing more than a banker-owned political puppet who does the bidding of his well-connected elitist masters. Washington's District of Columbia. Washington, D.C. is a concentrated cesspool of political criminals who work long and hard to create more laws, which in turn creates a fresh supply of law-breaking criminals. That's you and me. Known as the seat of government, this lavishly decorated and maintained area, with its ornate halls and granite pillars, funded courtesy of plundered taxpayers, covertly enshrines the ideals of national slavery by inching America closer to a totalitarian empire with its more than 73,000 laws listed in the federal code. When you hear government officials use the phrase, "we're doing this in the interest of national security," well, think of national security as the excuse used by governments to defend their exclusive action to plunder individuals within their territory. In other words, the exercise of monopolized power and force over the lives of individuals using the justification of collective security. Taxation. That means by which governments plunder, under the threat of force, the laboring energies of the citizenry in order to finance their wild expenditures. The dollar. No longer backed by gold or silver, our nation's money supply was officially hijacked back in 1913 by a cartel of criminal bankers and money manipulators who, for over 100 years, have engaged in a fiat currency Ponzi scheme where they issue bills of debt which robs through inflation, enslaves through fake credit, and deceives all who hold their counterfeit notes through a sleight-of-hand scam called fractional reserve banking. You see, after Nixon finally detached the paper currency from its precious metal backing, the international bankers' lucrative arrangement, which effectively ended the Bretton Woods Agreement, opened the floodgates of wild paper printing while requiring that all nations buy Federal Reserve notes so they could keep their economy afloat by purchasing oil with those counterfeit bills. And any nation who refused to cooperate with this arrangement would be targeted for military discipline. By this means, the bankers have successfully created the illusion of American prosperity. The war on drugs. Around the same time the U.S. defaulted on their international agreement, political puppet Richard Nixon officially declared the war on drugs, which is really not a war on drugs, but rather a war on people. People who have violated no one's rights and jeopardized no one's life. In 2010 alone, the U.S. federal government spent over $15 billion on the drug war. That's a rate of about $500 every second. State governments spent an additional $25 billion. Annual arrests for drug law violations average about 1.5 million per year, or 13% of total arrests. Someone is arrested for a drug law violation every 19 seconds. So you tell me, is this a war on drugs, or is this a war on people? Our wise political overlords appear to have created a series of oppressive drug laws as a cloaked excuse to strip individual rights, seize private assets, and supply their financially connected, prison-owning pals with a fresh supply of slave labor. And that brings us to our next term, incarceration. The lucrative prison industrial complex has ushered in the modern-day slave trade, where prison owners collect workers from a location by way of uniformed, badged, and heavily equipped enforcers who make arrests upon the general population for violating the fictitious war on drugs. Though in most cases, no crime is committed, no rights are violated, no victims are produced, these armed thugs proclaim that they're just following orders, as they write citations, plunder property, issue warrants, and wreak financial and physical hardship upon the very people they swore to protect and serve. Even though there are many more terms we could define here, the bottom line is this. Governments are what they are and not what they attempt to appear to be. When you strip away all the lies and practically define their deceptive terminology, they're nothing more than a gang of thugs who use their enforcers to stand in violent opposition to the freedom and lives of the very individuals they claim to be helping.
If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to this channel, One Truth for Life, right here on YouTube. For updates and additional content, follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/OneTruthForLife and on Twitter at OneTruthForLife.